Alrighty, welcome back to the Chap Chat podcast. Very excited about this episode. Our special guest is John G. Moore. I really can't express exactly how excited I am about having him on as a guest. Looking forward very much to the conversation. I will introduce John as the man who makes you laugh and the man who makes you think. But he is also the man who makes you remember things you thought you forgot. And his words take you back, just like an old song does. It always remembers the memory. And John's words do that. I am absolutely thrilled and privileged to have you on Chap Chat podcast. John, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's my honor to be on. Enjoy your podcast very much.
Well, thank you so much, John. I'm going to go through some of the, and I do say some because goodness, you are a very busy guy. But I'm going to go through some of the things that you do and have done, and that you are. So John is an author. He has 2 books, Rite of Passage, A Southerner's View of Then and Now. That's volume 1, and that's available on Amazon. John writes a syndicated newspaper column, More Thoughts, and that's carried by multiple different newspapers weekly. And my favorite part of that is the recorded version, the audible version of his column, and I really do enjoy that. I really love that. I love the wit.
Well, that's kind. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem at all. John does voiceover work in his own studio, and he is the voice of Audible. He reads books on audio for Audible. And he is the host of the John G. Moore podcast that's posted weekly, and I enjoy that very much. Your content on that is great. That can be found on Spotify, and then John's website, thecountrywriter.com. So, like I said, that is just a few things that you do, but you just do a fantastic job of all of those things. So I appreciate you.
Again, that's very kind. Thank you.
So I have been following you, I think, sometime between 2010 and 2012. I believe where I got hooked up with you was we were a friend of a friend. I think a friend of mine owned a radio station, and you were friends with him. And he said, man, this guy is just hilarious. And so I started following you back then, but I really have during that time just come to love not only your wit, but really respect your point of view and your wisdom as well. And that's really why I wanted you to come and be a guest here on Chap Chat podcast, because I really think you have a lot to offer the American people, honestly. So can you just share a little bit of your background, history, and what how you got to where you are now?
Well, first of all, thanks for that amazing description. I'd love to meet the guy you just described. That sounds quite impressive. That honestly, that's what happens when you live to be old. I was told that when I was young. If you live to be old enough, you're impressive because you just didn't die. So I've been really lucky in that I've been able to do most of the things I wanted to do in my life, and I give my mother a lot of credit for that, because when I was young, she used to say, you can be anything you want to be, you can do anything you want to do. And I took her seriously. And so throughout my life, I have embraced myriad of things and that includes starting out when I was about 8 years old. I used to listen to the radio at night when I wasn't supposed to be listening to the radio at night. I was supposed to be asleep,
There
but
you
I
go.
had a battery operated radio I would put under my pillow and turn it down low enough to hide it. And I would listen to WLS, WNOE. I would listen to KOA out of Denver, um, stations out of San Antonio, Dallas. I mean, you name it. If I could pick it up, I listened to it. And I was
Right.
always amazed by these people who were so far away and how it just felt like they were talking directly to me. And I couldn't understand how they could pull that off. I couldn't understand how the signal would go that far. And I wanted to understand all of those things. And so when I was about 8 years old, I began going over to the window in my bedroom that I shared with my younger sister. It was quite a bit younger than me. And I would set up my record player. Later, when I was a disc jockey, I was instructed it's called a turntable because that sounds more professional, but it was a record player. And I would pretend I was on the radio, and I would look out the window and describe the weather, and I did all of that, and knew at that point that's really kind of what I wanted to do for a living. I wanted to be an announcer. So when I was in the 11th grade, I'd taken, as we all get, an elective in school, and I had taken shop class, but I found it boring because my grandfather was a blacksmith. And so I pretty much knew how to do almost everything they were having us do, welding and woodwork. It was boring to me.
Right.
And so when I went to the 12th grade, I decided I was going to do something else. And pretty much all that was available for me to take by the time I hit the 12th grade was journalism.
Nice.
I think choir might have been an option. So I went for journalism. And although I also played bass in the school choir, but I did go into journalism, and they didn't have a writing position available in class, but they had a photography position. And so I was the photographer, one of the 4 photographers for the Ashdown, Arkansas high school newspaper and annual. And that was how I got my foot in the door in journalism. And that same year, on a dare, I went out to the local radio station and applied for a job, which turned into a 25-year career in radio.
Wow.
And along the way, I did some co-promotion with television, and so I did a little bit of television, but I was never really interested in TV. They all were paid poorly. Not that radio made a lot of money, but everybody I knew in television didn't make a whole lot of money. That's a misnomer. Most people think that you're getting rich if you're on television. You're not. None of the mediums pay any money, and I think that's one of the problems with journalism is people who have a dedicated ideology will go into it and sacrifice not having much. And so most people will go into something else that pays better. And eventually, after 25 years, that's what I did. I left the industry and went into public relations at a degree in journalism. But that's sort of my background is I've got a little bit of newspaper and in the beginning and a whole lot of radio, a little bit of television, a whole lot of PR, did 18 years of that. But in 2014, I started writing a blog at the encouragement of people who thought I had humor in me, and they said, you should write a blog. So I did, and someone at the local paper high up, one of the publishers, noticed it, asked me if they could reverse publish the blog as a column, and it went from that one newspaper in Tyler, Texas, to I'm now in 10 publications in the South. Closest one to you, I think, would be the Texarkana Gazette.
That's right. Yeah.
And so I'm doing that, and then I have 2 books I've published, and as you mentioned, I'm doing a weekly podcast, and the audio part of my weekly column that I record, I actually started that earlier this year at the request, not really at the request I offered, but there was a gentleman who read my column every week, and his wife sent me a note and said, my husband has lost his vision. He's gone blind, and just wanted to let you know he's really enjoyed reading it while he could. And I said, well, if I recorded it, would he listen to it? And she said, well, I think so. So I did that, and it went over really unexpectedly well with not just him, but a lot of people who were visually impaired. And so now I record my column every week in addition to my podcast and also the books I do on Audible. I just completed a book today for Audible on organic gardening. So if you're looking for some real excitement, that one should be available on Audible really soon.
Great. So
But that's sort of the long version of the snapshot of my life and background.
Well, that's quite a story. It sounds like, especially the last 10 years or so. It's from my listening to your podcast and your writings. It sounds to me like people would see a value or a talent and say, "Man, you really should do this." Almost kind of like how your career started in journalism on a dare. Have you ever thanked that person for that dare?
Well, the irony of it is his name is Alan Laws. And if you are listening, Alan, you still never paid me the bet. He bet me a case of beer that I would not go. Now, keep in mind, this was at a time when 18 was the drinking age, so we were legal to drink alcohol.
Right.
But he bet me a case of beer that I wouldn't go to the local radio station and ask the general manager for a job, and I did. And he told me to be there next weekend at 5:30 in the morning, and I showed up and wound up with a quarter-century career in the business.
Nice.
And Alan never paid me the beer. I still have no beer from Alan. So I want that on the record.
Right. Well, it's been recorded now. Oh, that's hilarious. Oh, man. So, I mean, you never got paid for it, but I guess the rest of us got to enjoy it, right?
Well, I hope so. It was an interesting journey through the business. I worked at several different radio stations over the years, and that's kind of what you have to do, or did do. Radio as we knew it back then does not exist today. It's pretty much automated, and there are very few people that are still working in the industry.
Mm-hmm.
But it was an interesting time to get in. It was an interesting time to get out. I got in the late 70s, and that was still the time of Top 40 radio. Top 40 radio was really hot.
Right.
And so I got to meet a lot of, great people, famous people, artists, actors. It was a good time to be young. It was a good time to be single. It was an interesting time to be alive, really. You didn't have a lot of the complications that we have today back then. You didn't have the internet. So the radio was really the way that people stayed connected. It was the way that you learned who the hot new artists were,
Right.
and actually got to, call in and vote on which records you liked. We had a feature on one station called "Make It or Break It," and
I remember that.
So people could call in and say, it stinks or I love it, and that would help determine whether a song got played on the air or not. But now everything is pretty much cookie cutter. I say pretty much. It is cookie cutter.
Right.
And you have, a handful of people deciding what music makes it on the air. Kind of off topic, but it's why I think music is not as good as it used to be. Because anytime you have a handful of people making decisions, they don't make good ones.
Correct. Yeah. Boy, and does that lead into another subject? But before we go into that subject, you just said something that was very interesting to me. You said that radio connected people back in the 70s and 80s, and I do remember that as a connector. We would sit around and listen to radio shows. I know that sounds like 1940s, 50s, but that's exactly what we did. We did that on Sunday afternoons. Saturday morning, we had our favorite radio station we listened to, and we would call in, and there was even like kind of like a Facebook marketplace kind of a setup where you would call in and swap things around on Saturday mornings.
Yeah,
And
there were a couple of different names for that. One was Swap Shop,
hmm
but my Swap and Shop, but my favorite one was Tradio.
oh, that's great. I didn't hear that one before.
Yeah, it was. I actually hosted both at different stations over the years.
Nice. Okay. So I mean, you understand and remember. I mean, I remember that as well. That radio really was much different back then. And
Oh, it was very, very different in a good way.
oh, definitely, yeah. And I think you're 100% correct and on target there, where uh, the music along with the programming has become cookie cutter, and that's why I no longer listen to the radio. um,
Yeah, I still listen to the radio, but I don't listen to a lot of it, and I'm very selective about what I listen to. Most of what I listen to is what I would call how do I even say this? The stations really haven't changed much. Like WSM out of Nashville that carries the Grand Ole Opry on Saturday
right,
night.
right,
Pardon me. You've got stations out of Dallas such as KRLD, WBAP, and the station where I live is KTBB. It's still local and news talk. But for the most part, most stations are just playing a playlist that was sent to them by someone in New York City, as if someone in New York City could come anywhere close to having their finger on the pulse of what people in East Texas or Arkansas want to listen
right.
to.
That's funny. Yeah, about the same time I started following you, and I think honestly, I was just following your jokes on your Facebook page at the time. But I met a guy who started an internet-based radio station, and he the thing I loved about it was it wasn't cookie cutter. I mean, it wasn't FCC, guideline, and um, the artist he had on, most of them are all like inspirational Christian country kind of, and so they were really fresh, different sounds. Maybe what you would have heard in the '70s, in uh, country music, where the sound was, wait a second, this is really different. Um, so I have kept in touch with that radio station, and I still follow it. It's hleradio.com, and I just love listening to that unscripted uh, show in the morning, and then the artists that are, they're actually artists that don't have somebody telling them what beat pattern to follow.
Yep, you're exactly right.
So you said changed in a good way, and I think the podcasting world is one of the things that have come out of that have changed in a good way. It's almost given us radio back, in a sense. I heard you the other day on the Windbreaker podcast. That was with Sarah Sloan, and I really enjoyed that episode. Uh, and on that, you mentioned something about, just in passing, being a libertarian. And then you went on to give a description of, your thoughts on being a libertarian. And I thought that was just great, honestly. It was someone who is not 20, that has lived a little bit of life, and studied and had a different view, and it wasn't, like you said, cookie cutter. And I thought, man, at the time I said, if I ever get to have John Moore on a podcast, I'm going to ask him to describe that a little better, and share that with us. So could you share that thought process with us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I was born in the 1960s in Southwest Arkansas, in 1962 to be exact. And so John Kennedy was the president, and my father had grown up during the Depression when FDR was doing the New Deal. And so basically everyone in my family was a Democrat. And so as I grew up, it was just a given that you were going to be a Democrat. And so my first election I ever voted in, I voted for Jimmy Carter. I had no idea why I was voting for Jimmy Carter. I just knew I was a Democrat, but I didn't know why I was a Democrat. So then in about 1984-ish, after I'd been married for a few years and had a couple of kids and had paid some taxes and didn't get a refund, I was kind of awakened. And so I decided that I was a Republican because it was the closest thing ideologically that I could figure out that I was.
Right.
And so, that created an uproar with my father especially, that I would not vote Democratic. What I tried to explain to him was that, in my view, the Democratic Party that he had grown up with and even I had grown up with as a child was no longer the Democratic Party that we knew. It had really almost morphed into a completely different thing. And, the Republican Party was sort of, I guess if I could explain it in the way that I see it, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the Republican Party that we knew in the 80s and 90s was really more like the Democratic Party of the earlier era.
Right.
And so as time went by, the Democrats and the Republican Party changed. And I could speculate on why, but the reality is that the Republican Party of today in 2020 and the Democratic Party of today in 2020 are really not either one of them.
Right.
Not at least what we grew up with and knew.
Right.
I would say that the Democratic Party has gone heavily towards socialist, which I never thought I would see. And the Republican Party has gone more toward populist, which, think Teddy Roosevelt. That would be probably the closest.
Mm-hmm.
And so a few years ago, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, I started realizing that I really was never a Democrat and I was really never a Republican. And so I began to search for what the heck I was, because I didn't seem to fit in any particular category. And I ran across libertarianism. And the gist of being a libertarian is that you believe that you should be allowed to believe what you believe, that within reason, as long as you're not hurting anyone else or causing any problems, you should be allowed to do what you want to do, and that the government should stay out of your business, and that they should be minimal. Basically, they should build roads and make sure the water is clean and protect the borders. And other than that, they really shouldn't be telling me which bathroom to use or any of the rest of that stuff.
Right.
Of course, when I came to this realization that I was a libertarian was long before the bathroom thing. But I found myself finally, after I was in my 50s, figuring out that I had never been who I thought I was, and I finally figured out who I was. And so that was just kind of eye-opening for me. My grandfather used to say what America needs is a good letting alone.
That's true.
And I remember thinking, what the heck does that mean? It was only much later that I understood what he meant, which is, people need to mind their own business. And that's where we've come in this country, is you've got one group of people who believe a certain way, and so if you don't buy what they're selling, then you're wrong. And there's no room for discussion or debate like there used to be. When I first started going to college, debate was a big thing, and we did a lot of debating. And
right.
We would be forced to take different sides and argue both points, and that was to give us some idea what the other guy or other girl was thinking. But that's not done today. The universities, for the most part, the media have been taken over by the left.
Hmm.
And I can say that because I'm a journalist, and I've been a
Right.
journalist my entire career.
Right.
And I remember sitting in newsrooms, um, through the years, being the only guy who was going, no, I really don't want to give my money to people who don't go to work, and no, I really, we we all we all should take care of ourselves. And so I found that over time, what I fit into was really the Libertarian Party, and so that's a long answer to a short question, but that's that's kind of who I am and where I found myself to be. And I will say that as I've talked to people over the last decade, what I've heard from a lot of people is, "Oh my gosh, I'm a libertarian too. I had no idea."
Right.
Now, what you got to keep in mind about libertarianism is it originally started in the late 1700s in France, and it was associated basically with communism and socialism. And there's still a faction in the U.S. that identify themselves as libertarians, but they're still the same way. So when someone says they're a libertarian, you almost have to have them define, well, what kind of libertarian are you?
Right.
And it's kind of different and difficult at times, but I would say the libertarian that I am is one who believes in free will and choice, small government, um, conservative economics, and self-reliance. And so, when you say what do you mean you're a libertarian? That's what I mean.
And that is a great description. And I think that a lot of people, if they took the time to think it through, kind of you like the way you've lived it, I think they may agree with that as well. And I know I find myself in that exact same spot. Uh, that I just believe in freedom, the freedom that our country was founded on, and if we would have a good spell of just being let alone, we may just have a great place to live with everybody, being able to pursue happiness.
Well, you need to keep in mind there's always going to be people in positions of power who are willing to trade you perceived security and safety
Mm,
for part of your liberties.
that is true.
And that is a trade that you cannot make twice.
No, no, man. That I haven't heard anything that well put in a while. And I think the initials for that is COVID-19. I could be wrong, but
No,
that
I think you're right. There are always, 9/11 is a prime example.
that's another one. Yep.
And I remember after 9/11 happened and they passed the Patriot Act, I remember saying, and that really 9/11 was the beginning of me looking around going, wait a minute,
Mm-hmm.
no one's going to come out of the woodwork and try to take care of us, meaning my family.
Right.
I have to figure this out. And when I looked around, I realized that we lived in the middle of town. We had about a week's worth of groceries in the house, and we were not prepared for any sort of disaster. Had we been in New York City, we could have gone without food. We could, and I thought, this is not good.
Right.
And I knew growing up, my grandparents used to have what are called victory gardens,
Right.
which were something that was pushed by Franklin Roosevelt,
Mm-hmm.
and Churchill in
Right.
in the UK. And growing your own food was one way to. It was really the way that most people fed their families was to raise their own food, livestock, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But it was also a way to help the war effort, which was to make sure you weren't trying to tap into food that needed to go to the troops or whomever else. And so it was at that point my wife and I began to grow our own food, a lot of it, not all of it,
Right.
and to make sure that we were prepared for any sort of disaster that could come along because we were not
Right.
at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And so we always try to make sure that we have um, access to water and food. And if you look at, what the federal government recommends as far as FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Administration, they recommend that you have X amount of food, X amount of water, and all that per person
Mm-hmm.
to get you through a certain amount of time.
Right.
And so, people people will say those nutty preppers. Well,
Right.
the government is recommending that we do this.
Right.
There's nothing nutty about it. It's sensible.
Correct. Yeah.
It's the same thing they taught us in Scouts. Be
Right.
prepared.
Right. So now 9/11, what you said was kind of your wake up call. Now COVID-19 has been obviously a big disruption in life. How do you feel as far as preparedness now compared to 9/11?
Apples and oranges, to be honest with you, Brian. I mean, 9/11 was a one-off attack by a handful of terrorists who changed everything for us. We went from being able to walk into an airport and get on a plane to here we are almost 20 years later still having to take our shoes off
Mm-hmm.
to get on an airplane. And so, that's one thing. COVID-19, a pandemic, which, by the way, as I mentioned, I worked in healthcare for 18 years. We've had many other, and this is not to downplay the problems of COVID-19. A lot of people have lost their lives and become really sick from it. So
Correct.
I'm
Yeah.
not dismissing this in any way.
No.
But there have been lots of other medical scenarios in the last 20 years where more people have died, and flu and pneumonia are prime examples. We lose a lot of wonderful people every year to the flu and pneumonia. It happens every single year, and we don't think much about it because it happens every single year.
Right.
But I think COVID-19 is if you will, a shot across the bow. It's a warning that this could have been a whole lot worse than it is, and it
Mm-hmm.
still could be a whole lot worse than it is.
Right.
But all we've had to do so far is basically stay in our houses. But based on the severity of a pandemic, it could be passed along much easier than it is. So, who knows? I don't know where the COVID-19 thing is going, and I don't know, will there be something worse in the future? Well, it's possible.
Right.
But 9/11 and what we're going through now are really quite different. If you think about 9/11, everybody still went to work.
Right.
Everybody, life went on, especially if you were living somewhere other than New York or the Pentagon or wherever was affected. We didn't fly in airplanes for a while, but I don't fly in airplanes that often anyway. So,
Right.
it back then, other than just kind of wondering where the world was going, it really didn't affect my family that much,
Mm-hmm.
other than we, just felt affected and awful about what had happened.
Right. Well, you said that you were living in town and you had about a week's worth of groceries, and now you said you were, growing your own food or a lot of it. When it came to the point where we weren't supposed to travel or go out or, um, do the normal things that we would normally do. In that way, did you feel like you maybe had learned a little bit from, your previous experiences and had changed your life a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. We had already begun to prepare to plant our spring garden before COVID-19 happened, and my wife primarily does most of the gardening. I, do the tilling and help her and whatever, go pick up things, fertilizer, whatever.
Right.
Um, but we had already started our spring garden, and we grow organically. We do not use pesticides, herbicides, fungicides. We don't use any of that. We let nature do what it does. What the victory gardens of the Second World War, we grow our gardens in the same way.
Nice. Okay.
And so we were already on our way to that, and had saved our seeds from the fall garden and the last spring garden, and we're ready to go.
Hmm.
And so we basically just continued forth in what we would have done anyway.
No.
And so, what had we learned? Well, we learned it a long time ago, almost 20 years ago. We lived in town at the time and had a very small garden. And in the early 2000s, we bought a place out in the country on some acreage, and we have 6 garden areas, and we have a pond with fish, and so we have a water source and source for fish, and we have food that we grow. And I know in the early days when we were doing this, a lot of my friends, made fun of us, and they're not making fun of us now.
No, I bet they are not. You look pretty smart now, don't you?
Yeah, but that was a complete accident. That was the unintentional piece of it.
Oh man. So we in a previous conversation you and I had, uh we mentioned a thought process of giving, basically giving to others what we have to give, whether it's something that we do like the sweat of our brow, kind of an action to help somebody in the community, or um, if we maybe don't like that's happening in politics, we actually go do something about it, get involved um, in a bodily form, give money if we can. But we talked about that kind of a thought process, and you mentioned that you were able to work in legislature this last year. Can you kind of give me your thought process on that and maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Um, in the early 2000s, after I had my political epiphany about who I was, my next thought was, well, put up or shut up. And if you're going to complain about how things are going, you need to be willing to get off your duff and go do something about it. And I had served on a number of boards over the years for charitable organizations. I'd been the president of some, and served in different roles. And you can always give money, but your ability and your time are really far better than any currency that you can ever give to an organization. And so I learned early on. I joined the JCs when I was 18 years old, and then all the way up through last year, I was involved in charities. And not to say that I won't be going forward, but just to say that that was the last one I was involved in. And I've always felt it important to share knowledge. If you have a skill set, teach it to somebody else so that they can pass it on when you're gone. It's the old, don't give a man a fish, teach him to fish. And that's kind of how I've tried to approach life, is to make sure that if I have an ability or a skill set, that I offer that, and try to make sure that others are willing to do the same. And I would just encourage people to remember that right now, one of the hard hit areas of the economic sector that nobody's really talking much about are the 501c3s, or the charities. Many of the volunteers who work for charities are either retired, older, and or both, and many of them are not getting out of the house because they have a health risk. And so if you have time to donate money, or to get involved, or to be connected to a charity, I would encourage you to do it. The 80-20 rule is very true, and I learned this in many different organizations in which I volunteered, and that is 20% of the people on a board or in an organization do 80% of the work.
That's the truth.
So you can give money, and that's great,
Mm-hmm.
and organizations need money, but they also need, you know, they need people who can get out and actually do the work.
Yes, that is true. So true. Um, so is that was that the driving force behind your thought process to um, do a short stint in the legislature, kind of feeling that out, or just putting your money where your mouth is and saying, "Hey, I'm gonna, maybe make a little bit of sacrifice of my time and go do this."
Well, to be honest with you, there were two reasons. Just so folks know exactly what we're talking about, I served as senior policy advisor for Texas District 6 State Representative Matt Schaefer during the '86 legislature in Texas, and I was based in Tyler but went to Austin multiple times and worked in the Capitol. And that was to do two things. I supported Representative Schaefer. I met him before he was ever elected the first time, and essentially when I met him at another political debate, he told me he was going to run for office, and so I interviewed him for the job right there on the spot. And
Nice.
when he was finished telling me why I should vote for him, I stuck out my hand and I said, "I will give you money and I will help you get elected." And I've
Wow.
done that each time since then. And so last year, which was many years after he'd been elected, he reached out to me and said, "I have a position open, and I know you have many jobs, and I don't know that you'll have the time to come down and do this for 6 months,
Right.
but would you be interested?" And I jumped at the chance. I said, "Absolutely." And no, it wasn't for the money because there wasn't a whole lot of money in it.
Right.
But I felt like, number one, I was being called to do it. And,
Hmm.
if you're asked to serve your state or your city or your country, you know, it's, I believe it's your responsibility to say yes.
Yeah.
But if I'm honest, I've honestly thought about running for public office at some point in the future. And so it was twofold. It was to answer the call, but it was also to see, the ropes and how things worked, and if I did run for office, what I could expect. So,
I gotcha. Well, you got my vote. I,
well,
you,
okay,
you've got to run for something that is outside of Texas. So,
it'd have to be a national election. It
right,
couldn't be a
right,
state election. Yep.
yeah. So John
Well,
G.
I
Moore for
appreciate
president.
that. Well, I don't know that I want to run for president. That's one I've never really understood is why anybody would want to be the president.
Oh my goodness. Now, I mean, when I was younger, I thought, wow, but not now. Oh my goodness. Yeah, I don't understand that at all either. Whew, that's you're just, you're gonna take a beating either way, no matter what. So,
Yeah, it doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on. That is
no,
not an easy gig.
no. Yeah, I mean, you can always tell by their hair. They age
Yep,
probably
and
20
the
years.
wrinkles.
Yeah, yep. It's a rough. I mean, there has got to be the most immense amount of pressure in that chair.
I cannot even imagine.
Me either. Me either. So one last question. I know that you do some speaking on history, ancestry, uh, those kinds of topics. I'm a little bit of a history buff myself. I love history, because I want to know where I came from. Not me necessarily, but say American history, and why it was founded, those kinds of, and then prior to that, what led up to America being founded, and those kind of those kind of thoughts, and uh, so I know you're far advanced in that area than I am, and so I'd kind of like to get your thoughts on why you think history and ancestry is important.
Well, I'm certainly repeating a quote that I can't attribute to anyone because I can't remember who said it originally, but and I'm paraphrasing because I'm not going to get it right, but you know, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And I think that's very true. And for me, um, it's an interesting story, and I'll make it as quick as I can. But um, what I knew about my father's side of the family was very little. All I knew that was my father's grandfather, my great grandfather, was one of several children, and they were coming from the Carolinas in a covered wagon, and they got to Arkansas, and the mother and the father died in a flu pandemic, and the children were scattered to the wind. And so there was no family Bible to say who married whom or where they were from. So we basically lost all of the more family history.
Wow.
And so when ancestry.com and 123 and all those other things came out, I looked at that and thought, well, it may not tell us names, but it will at least tell us, where we started. And so my father, myself, my wife, my mom, a number of us took the ancestry DNA test, and it came out, at least for my father and me, that we were 97% British. And then it showed the chart of from where in the 1700s we had left the UK and made our way to the Carolinas, living in the Carolinas until the mid 1800s, and then in the late 1800s migrating west. We think maybe that our family was trying to make its way to the Oklahoma land rush, and anyway, things stopped in Arkansas, and that's where my family's been ever since. But, you need to know who your own family is, and you need to understand history, and it's not necessarily imperative that you understand what role your family played in history, but I think it's important to understand history itself and why things happened. If you look back to 1789, which was the year of the French Revolution. We were talking earlier about me being a libertarian.
Mm-hmm.
The first reference to libertarians was in 1789, and that was the same year as the French Revolution, Marie Antoinette and all of that. And
Right.
so understanding history is important, because if you don't know the mistakes people have made before you or the successes they've enjoyed before you, then you could very likely make the same poor choices that they've made rather than the good choices that they've made. And so, it's sort of like me trying to work on, yesterday I was trying to replace a light switch in the living room, and I quickly realized that I was in above my head, and so I called an electrician. The
Right.
problem with not understanding history is you don't know that you can get electrocuted, and so you sally forth and wind up making the same bad mistake, only to wind up with the same bad results. And
Right.
so that's my take on understanding history and trying to learn from it.
I love it. So learning from history versus repeating.
Absolutely. Yeah.
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 So just a final thought as we head out and talking about history. And I mentioned that when I was younger, I would listen to radio broadcasts, and that was a normal thing. In fact, I mean, I even remember what time I had I had to be in front of the radio at 3:30 on Sunday afternoon. Uh, but I remember listening to Paul Harvey and the rest of the story, and I didn't really get a lot of the things that Paul Harvey was talking about because I was so young, but I do remember the stories, and I remember connecting with that, and I remember connecting with his voice, and it was such a great memory for me, a great childhood memory, and I'd really kind of like what I said at the beginning of the podcast. I it was almost a memory I had forgotten, and until this weekend, and my wife and I were traveling. We had our I have a 10 and an 11-year-old. I take that back. A 10 and a 12-year-old. She would kill me for doing that. But anyway, I also I also have older children. We have 6 total, so we have a pretty full family. But those are the 2 we still have at the house. And we were traveling, and uh, I was looking for your newspaper column, and so we were able to play that through the stereo of the vehicle, and we all got to laughing, and just everything that was funny about that column, which is almost every column, and my memory went back to those times with Paul Harvey and the rest of the story, and I thought, man, what a great opportunity to be able to pass something like this down to my children, part of my history that I loved and I get to repeat with my children. So thank you for doing that and giving that to us. I so appreciate it.
Well, I can't tell you what a huge compliment that is to have what I did in the same conversation with Paul Harvey. I certainly would never compare myself to Paul Harvey, but thank you. That's kind.
Well, I maybe not in some circles, but I still say John G. Moore for president. So,
Oh, well, all right then. Off we go.
Oh, here we go. We're on the way. John, thank you so much for your kindness, your grace, your willingness to give to other people. Just amazes me. You really, it's just an honor to know you. And
well, the same here, Brian. I appreciate your friendship of, I guess we first met almost 10 years ago, if not longer.
Right. Yep. And so
even if it was through Facebook.
Hey, yeah. Hey, there's some good things come from Facebook.
Not many, but
no,
some.
Yes, just a few. Thank you so much, John. I really do appreciate it. You are an amazing man, an amazing friend, and I appreciate you being on Chap Chat podcast.
Well, thank you, Brian, and God bless.
All right, and thank you. And folks, if you want to find out more about John G. Moore, you can go to thecountrywriter.com. That's thecountrywriter, as in writing, writer.com. And you can look up John G. Moore podcast on Spotify. The broad road